Over the last year and a half, I've been slowly upgrading my PC, and I finally got what I would consider my less crucial component to my build, although some people would argue that's not crucial, and I agree with you, but at the same time, I got an NVMe SSD, and it's a high-performance storage solution, and basically, they're really freaking awesome, and I'm not building this machine to be pretty or anything like that, and so I'm actually going to be using this performance, but a lot of people would be like, why are you spending so much money? And obviously, aside from just the, obviously performance stuff that I want, it also comes down to a matter of perspective. Michael here with Design View, and today we're going to be talking about how your PC can change your perspective of the digital world and obviously some physical world as well in certain different aspects. And obviously this is a Design View series. So I'm obviously going to be talking about design and stuff like that. So I want to talk about how you can look at different pieces of hardware and how you can use them to actually design differently, and how you can actually take into consideration how different people are going to be seeing different types of rigs and different types of content on these sort of rigs as well. And so basically, I'm mostly going to be focusing on that for most of this video, but I do want to start off basic and talk about how your PC can actually change your perspective based on what games you're playing or what type of content you're consuming or what videos you're watching and yada yada. And so I want to talk about that first. Now, obviously, if you are into design, you are into art and things like that, let's say game design or, graphic design, web design, or anything along those sorts of lines, you should probably end up listening to the rest of this. However, if you're into gaming, obviously, listen to the first part. And if you want a little bit of insight into some of the industry's sort of stuff that they end up doing, and sort of the things to kind of get a little bit of understanding of why certain things may not be designed particularly well on your machine, but it's not something a lot of people end up looking at, you can obviously listen to the rest of it as well. But let's go ahead and start off. I want to talk about the basics first, the low-end, mid-end, and high-end sort of software and hardware. Not software, hardware. And so basically, when you're actually looking at hardware, you end up getting into the situation to where you look at a lot of stuff and you're like, all right, what if I'm on a low-end rig? And you end up going into the situation to where a lot of people running on these lower-end rigs that have never used high-end rigs, they get a little bit confused when you talk about upgrading tech. When I was actually upgrading my PC, and this is what kind of sparked this sort of discussion, there were always these sort of people that were like, why are you trying to upgrade your PC? Like, I'm talking about this new rig, and I'm like, oh my God, this is going to be amazing. It's going to have all these like extra hardware and everything. And I'm like, yeah, it's going to be so awesome. I'm going to get such a huge performance boost. And they're like, why do you need performance? Because a lot of people end up just using, computers for like, let's say a web browser or something like that. And it's very, very basic. And they might use it for word processing, for school or work, or they might use it for Excel. And those things don't really seem to have a large perspective in the sort of like tech industry in general, which is a little bit, unfortunate, but at the same time, you can end up getting into the advanced stuff. Let's say they're actually running on a higher rig. You can actually go into and see that these word processors and stuff like that, you have a much bigger screen or you have a better keyboard, and you can actually get all this different sort of hardware that makes these sort of experiences way better. Obviously, also footage in the background is probably going to be boring for a second. I'm just literally putting things on the marketplace, and I'm just going by the default sale because I don't really care. I just want it out of my inventory and out of my way so I can continue on to a world boss. It will get interesting. I promise we're mostly going to be writing because this is a very poor time for me to recording. But when it gets into gaming and stuff like that, you actually go into a huge sort of thing, because I did say the digital world. And what do I exactly mean by that? I mean gaming, videos, and that sort of thing. If you are somebody who watches a lot of videos, your monitor can actually affect how well you're actually able to watch these different videos. Let's say, for example, monitors. You can actually have things like color accuracy. So certain monitors will have different colors that they can reproduce. I have a high-end monitor. Well, it's semi-high-end. It's kind of mid-end nowadays. But anyways, back on topic. It's one of those situations where I can actually see colors and they look very vibrant and everything. However, if I go on to, like, let's say my laptop, which is a low-end machine, it's going to have very faded out colors because it's using a TN panel. And I'll talk a little bit more in depth about that later and talk about how you can design around it. But at the same time, the more powerful of a rig you have and the more money you invest into it, the actual better experience you can get when it comes down to digital worlds. You can see this very easily in games, for example. You might not notice it in things like 2D platforms and stuff like that. Aside from colors and things like that, you may end up noticing resolution sometimes and things to where maybe your resolution isn't very well. Like maybe it's not very high, and so when you're actually running on a lower end, let's say rig, and you actually have a low resolution, you'll notice some UI might be a little bit blurry or hard to see, or maybe the UI takes up a lot of the screen, and so you're not really able to do much inside the game. Maybe you'll notice things like frame rates are low and the game feels a little bit unresponsive. However, when you end up actually upgrading your machine or going to a higher end rig, you'll notice that things feel a lot more responsive and they actually feel much better. In the real world, when you drop a cup, you drop it and you can see it drop, you feel it drop out of your hand, and you can watch it hit the ground and shatter, depending if it's glass or plastic. Maybe you're one of the people like me that likes to use plastic cups and it doesn't shatter, and so you just see it bounce. But when you actually go into the digital world, what can end up happening is if you don't have that higher end rig to actually see all those little details and actually have that feeling, like let's say you know the game actually skips all those frames to where the cup is slipping out of your hand, you have no idea that the cup is slipping out of your hand. So when you actually go into these higher end rigs, you're able to actually feel all of that. And it sounds so weird when you actually talk about a digital world and you're like, oh yeah, I can feel it. You know, it is actual one of those kind of actual physical things to where you can actually feel the game. It feels much more fluid, and it's very hard to understand without actually experiencing it. And one of the things that, you know, things can do inside of developers and everything like that, when you're actually developing games or you're actually working on, let's say, web pages, for example, there's a lot of web page stuff like, let's say, HTML5. A lot of people love to throw up a lot of YouTube videos and things like that. Know that on lower end rigs, that's actually going to take up a lot of memory, and not a lot of these low end rigs are going to have a lot of that. And so you can actually run into a situation to where you just end up bogging down your clientele, and basically they're going to have a very poor experience, and it change the way people perceive your website. If they go onto your website and it acts slow, even if it's their machine's fault, they're going to be like, oh wow, this web page is slow, and so it loads slow. There are people that say YouTube runs really, really slowly. However, whenever I go to a YouTube page, it immediately loads up a video. It is immediately there, and I'm able to watch it right there, and it has no problems. This can also go down to network as well. So you want to make sure that web pages, for example, if you're working on web pages, or let's say you're working on a game and you're doing online game stuff. This is going into more design stuff, by the way. That was a smooth transition. You want to make sure that your netcode ends up having nice enough compensation to where people with lower end networks are not going to be seeing banding. Or let's say, let's say their network is maybe not in your region. For example, if I try to play a game that's in Asia, I am not headed the right direction. I was trying to head here. I think I'm headed here. Sorry, got lost in the game for a second. This is what happens when I talk too much. But, you know, you end up looking at these netcodes, and you want to make sure that maybe they're, you know, not in the same region. Like, let's say you're making a game, but you can only afford one server, or maybe you can't use a large server service. You want to make sure your netcode is able to compensate for that so that the game doesn't feel stuttery, so it doesn't feel unpleasant to play. You want to make sure that they look at it and be like, oh, hey, I'm actually playing with these people over the internet, and you want it to feel like they're there. And once again, that word feeling is going to come into play, and this is actually what this main perspective is going to go into play. It is a lot of feeling, and it's a lot of what you see and perceive in the way that you actually play these games. And this goes into every single piece of hardware that you have into it, because basically every single piece of hardware that you have on your computer is going to change how you use it. It's kind of like a tool. If you have a jack of all trades tool, you can actually look at it and be like, all right, well, I have all these sort of things that I can end up using. This is not where I was headed. Oh my God, I am lost, aren't I? I don't know where I'm actually headed. Welp, I think oh, it's right here. I'm like almost there. There we go. Sorry, trying to figure out where he's at. I swear if it doesn't spawn when I get there, I'm going to be very upset. But regardless, you know, it goes into one of those situations where every single piece of hardware can actually affect how you use it, like a tool. For example, if you have a jack of all trades tool, you're going to be like, wow, this tool can do all these sort of things. However, if you have a spoon, let's say you have a spork. Let's use a spork because nobody ever talks about sporks. When you have a spork, you're like, all right, I can stab things with this, but I can also spoon things with it. If you only have a fork, you're only going to learn how to use things with a fork. And you may be like, how do I actually drink soup? Like, you would probably be like, hey, I'm going to need to tilt over a bowl or something like that. And so that's going to be your perspective. That's going to be how you perceive that you would drink soup or you would consume soup. However, that's not going to be the case with everyone, because some people are going to have a spork or a spoon. And they're going to be like, all right, well, the people with the spoons are going to be like, hey, I'm going to be able to go in and actually use this. But then they're not going to be able to say like, hey, how am I supposed to eat this? I don't know. I'm terrible with food analogies. This quiche. How am I going to eat this quiche with a spoon? Yes, it's possible, but at the same time, it's very unpleasant. And I would rather have, let's say, a fork, for example. So you have a spork, and then you can do both. Terrible example, but it also gets the point across. And so basically, you're able to look at that, and that can change the way that your perspective works. And so when it comes down to computers, let's talk about monitors first. Monitors are one of the very most easily overlooked aspects of computers in general, I would say. Whenever you look at lower-end computers or pre-built or anything like that, they never talk about the monitors that they come with. And this is a very huge failure, I would say, on the part of pretty much everyone when it comes down to the perspective of tech in general, because the monitor is one of the most crucial components to your experience whatsoever, because without a monitor, you have no idea what's what's going on, because we don't live in the days of the Commodore to where you're going to have little lights and things like that. Well, not Commodore, it's before the Commodore, but regardless, not in the days where computers were these little tiny lights of binary information that you would see pop up on screen. This is something that where you actually see visual input. You see things on screen. When you're looking at the screen, you may not be able to see everything, but there's still detail there. There's things exploding. This is a world boss. There's things exploding. And so you're going to see that sort of perspective. You're going to look at it and be like, yes, that's actually what I'm looking at. And so this is literally your portal to the digital world. So when it comes down to actually looking at what sort of monitors to get, you want to look at things like, let's say, color accuracy, for example. You want monitors where you can actually see things properly, but maybe you don't care. Maybe you care about high refresh rates. Then you're going to want a monitor that's going to actually run into high frame rate so that you can look at things and have them look smoother. The higher the frame rate you have, this is not a topic I'm going to go too in depth on here. I'll do it in another design video. But regardless, the higher the frame rate you have, you can actually look at it and be like, all right, it looks smoother, because the more frames that you have, the more natural it's going to look, because realistically, the world does not run in picture frames. They run in a fluid light motion. And so when you have more frames, you can actually look at it and it will look more like a fluid image, and therefore improve your experience, and it will improve your perspective. If you have a low-end monitor, for example, you may not be able to have the lights and lows, like the contrast that you need to actually see in light and dark regions in the game. So for example, let's say in Black Desert, which is the game in the background, right now everything is exploding and there's a lot of contrast going on. My footage is going to be, artifacted to all living hell, thanks YouTube. But regardless, since I have a high quality monitor, I can see the differences between absolute black and the absolute white, which is going to be a huge difference in different types of monitors, because lower end monitors will not be able to see this sort of thing. And a lot of people are going to be using these low end monitors, or even some higher end monitors will not be able to see it because they made a trade-off. Some monitors are going to have a trade-off in the color accuracy or the depth that it's going to have in its contrast, and they're going to be like, hey, instead we're going to have it so that it has, oops, I died. It's going to make it so that you can actually see a lot more, let's say, frame rate, for example. That's one of the hugest, trade-offs, is they end up going for a higher color accuracy, or the lower color accuracy, and have a higher frame rate. Now, when you're designing for these sort of systems, you need to keep that in mind as well. There was recently, well, not really recently, it was quite a few months ago, but there was a game I ended up playing called Slime Sand, which it's an alright platformer. I have a review of it if you want to actually know my details on it. But for the most part, one of the problems I actually had is that on my monitor that I was using at the time, the colors were too bright and too much contrast was there, and it made it very, very difficult to actually tell what was going on. However, I was actually, had a lot of people being like, I don't see your problem with this. I can actually see everything perfectly fine, and I'm not having the problem that you are. And I understand that. That makes perfect sense, because when I actually loaded it up on my laptop, which is a lower end machine and actually runs on a TN panel, I noticed that I didn't have that problem on that machine, because basically the color contrast was not high enough to actually cause my eyes problems. It didn't cause the problems when there was actually these different high contrast colors, because basically the contrast of the monitor was actually contradicting it, and therefore the actual colors were not going to be quite there. And this also makes a counterpoint, for example, that on these lower end kind of monitors, it was actually showing the absolute highest contrast that it possibly could on those monitors, whereas on the higher end monitors it may not. And so this was kind of a design oversight by the developers. I don't know whether they were using the high contrast or the low contrast, whether it was intentional or not, but maybe they were using the low contrast monitors, and so they're like, hey, you need to look into actually how you're designing this and maybe make it so there's different options. The game had various different filters that would affect contrast as well, but all of them ended up making it worse, which was a little bit unfortunate, and it was a complaint in my review. But for the most part, this is one of those aspects to where they can look at it and be like, all right, well, how can we improve this for everyone? And so when you're designing for different monitors, especially when you're using things like, let's say, artwork, for example, you want to make sure that your colors are not going to clash in the inappropriate ways. And so when I was working on art, for example, whenever I was working on my lower laptop, I would bring everything to the college I was attending at the time to actually look at it on the higher color monitors and be like, all right, are these colors actually the colors I want them to? Now that I'm working on a higher color, color resolution monitor, when I didn't have access to those other ones, I noticed that some of my artwork actually had the inappropriate colors. They had wrong coloring in certain spots because I didn't have the color to represent it. And so when it ended up printing, it didn't look proper because I didn't have the right color accuracy. My monitor was, not able to produce those colors. And so this goes into perspective to where when you're actually designing for different monitors, and especially when you're going into graphic design for like physical products or artwork, and you want these things to be printable, you want to make sure that your colors are, accurate. You want to make sure that you're actually looking at the colors that you need on your monitor, and this can change your ultimate perspective because it's going to change the colors you see. And, you know, to kind of simplify everything as well, this is going to change what your consumers see, what your clientele sees. If your clientele wanted a specific, you know, color on their website, you know, you need to make sure it's going to be that specific color and not just the color they end up, you know, deciding on. When it goes into a physical color, you know, sure, it might look like it on their monitor, but you want to make sure it'll actually look like it on everyone's monitors. And what you can actually do is HTML5 actually has monitor detection software. Well, not software, but like code. And so you can actually use that code to be like, all right, well, I want this specific color on different types of monitors and different types of contrast ratios. And you can actually use that. And I think it's JavaScript. It's not technically HTML5. But at the same time, you can end up using that. And let's say resolution, for example, you can adjust based on resolution and things like that as well. And you can make sort of predictions based on that resolution as well. So lower resolutions are going to generally have that lower color reproduction, while higher resolution monitors are either going to have an audience that's not necessarily, or is going to be knowledgeable and not necessarily care about that color reproduction. Therefore, they're not necessarily going to be the ones that you're going to be worrying about. Or it's going to be color monitors that are going to be able to actually reproduce whatever colors you end up throwing at it, which is going to be nice as well. And when it goes down to web design, also staying within the general RGB sort of standards that go into web design as well. It's less relevant now since everyone basically has at least a decent monitor, especially the low-end machines. You know, they're getting in to at least having a decent TN monitor, so you're not going to run into monitors that aren't going to be able to display non-256-bit colors. So most of those warnings that you get in Photoshop or, you know, other sorts of image software, don't really pay attention to them. But at the same time, it is nice to kind of look at that and make sure to actually look at your contrast based on what your audience is actually going to be looking at. Now let's go ahead and go into power, because that basically covers the monitors. You know, monitors, one of those things, especially if you're going into buying monitors and stuff like that. You know, I was talking about, you know, upgrading my PC and stuff like that. When I was shopping for monitors, it was something that was very overlooked. You want to look at the contrast ratio and brightness ratio and make sure that that's somewhere that you would want to. I'm not going to go in depth about it, but basically if you have a high contrast ratio and a high color reproduction, I can't remember exactly what this monitor is, but I'd say this is kind of like the sweet spot where you actually get into the point where it's not too expensive. Do keep in mind that TN panels are going to have a very low kind of quality color, and you're actually going to get a lot of inaccurate color. There are some TN panels that get pretty dang close, I will say, and I've actually seen some TN panels that do look gorgeous, but you will not get the, you know, bright and vibrant colors that you're going to get on, let's say, an IPS panel. So if you're looking for a color reproduction panel, get an IPS, like no doubt, or an OLED or any of the other higher ends, but they're going to be definitely way above it. And you're obviously, if you're buying those sorts of things, don't listen to my advice because I don't have one. But when it comes down to monitors, if you're looking for one within affordable prices, do look into the IPS panels, because those are definitely where I would say the color reproduction's at. If you want just frame rate for gaming and stuff like that, TN panels work perfectly fine. They're all right. I don't like them because I prefer a good color reproduction, but at the same time, not everyone cares. Some people are like, I don't care about colors. And just make sure you get one with decent colors, like decent contrast ratio and decent color reproduction, because if you don't, you're going to run into situations where you go into like a cave-in game and you can't see everything because it's just too dark. But let's go ahead and go into, I already touched on this quite a bit, but let's go into general power, things like GPU and CPU. Now, when it comes down to GPUs and CPUs, when it comes down to actual games and visuals that you get in game, or let's say web browsing and things like that, there's not necessarily going to be too much variation, because we've kind of gone beyond the zone to where every sort of different system is going to have different specs and everything like that, and they're going to be able to see different things. Like, let's say, you know, graphics card specific effects and things like that, those don't exist anymore. Even those that NVIDIA or AMD produce, they always run off CPU as well anyways, so you don't actually need the actual physical hardware to run it. And so that's one of those aspects where you don't necessarily have to worry about it these days. Yes, it is nice to know about it, but it's not necessarily something I'm going to be talking about here. What you really do want to concern about, however, is the people that can actually access your software, hardware, or actually view your content as well. When it comes down to videos and stuff like that, you don't necessarily need to worry about it too much, but let's say your target audience is mostly going to be kids or, you know, adults that aren't necessarily going to be worried about the quality of the content. Then you can actually look at things like, let's say, rendering lower resolution videos, for example, or you're not going to be necessarily worrying about frame rate. 30 FPS is most likely going to be all their machines are going to be running, because maybe they don't have the power to actually run these higher machines, because they're not going to be necessarily worried about it or not going to be used to it and stuff like that. And so yes, it will be less smooth for those that do care about it, but it's one of those things where you can actually make an optimization in your sort of design and stuff like that. But when it comes down to higher end video, you do want to make sure that you are running at, let's say, a good frame rate. You don't want a 20 FPS video on, let's say, a review. Oh my god, I hate it when I look at a review and the game is running at 20 FPS the entire time. And like, it's just the footage. It's not even like the game, but the footage is running at 20 FPS. It boggles my mind because, hey, I want to be able to see what the game actually runs at. And if it runs at 20 FPS, it's not going to be... it's going to be a little bit misleading, especially if the game doesn't actually run at 20 FPS. I want to see if it actually runs at least a solid 30. I won't blame somebody for having 60 FPS footage. Not having it is pretty understandable because 60 FPS footage is pretty hard to capture sometimes. But at the same time, it's a good thing to actually look at having the proper resolution or proper frame rate and the proper resolution as well, especially if you're doing something like, let's say, a video game review. When I do my reviews, I make sure I have the, oh god, I got stunned and I'm probably going to die. I always make sure to try and have the highest resolution, highest, color quality that I possibly can. I use my higher rendering preset, so it's actually rendering at maximum depth, and so I make sure that it's actually going to display what the game would look like in its best light. Obviously, YouTube and things like that is going to kind of make sure that it gets artifacted to living hell, but at the same time, I do what I can to make sure it actually represents what I'm doing. However, when it comes down to lower end quality stuff, like let's say Let's Plays or anything like that, let's say, another great example. Let's say you're doing an advertisement. Let's say you have some live action stuff. Like, this isn't video game related, but let's say it's, advertising and stuff like that. You want to make sure you have the maximum render resolution. You want to make sure it's rendered at the right, frame rate and everything like that for whatever network that you're sending it to and things like that. That's also incredibly important. Now, how does that actually change the perspective of the consumer, and why should they care? Well, the realism is that, like, let's say when you're doing like a review or something like that, you want to actually represent the video properly. You want to make sure the video actually looks proper. Oh my god, I do not want to die again. Yep, I got away. You want to make sure the video actually represents what you're looking at properly. And let's say you're doing let's say it's something like video game Let's Play or something like that. You want to make sure that they're able to actually see what you're doing. If your video is running at 15 FPS, it's not only going to be miserable to watch, it's going to look like a slideshow, but it's also going to run into situations where they may not necessarily get the same experience that you do, even though that's part of the point of Let's Play. Some people do comedy Let's Plays and that's all, but they don't really, share off the game. And that's perfectly fine. But at the same time, you should make it so it's still an enjoyable experience for the viewer, and having a higher frame rate and having the proper resolutions and everything that can actually affect that. And when it comes down to people ended up using different types of hardware, when you're actually going into, like, let's say targeting higher end markets, such as, for example, whenever I do reviews, I do PC reviews, and I expect people to actually have a baseline understanding of the PCs they are actually running. Then I want to make sure that I actually have it representing those sort of aspects and make sure that you're actually designing, everything around it. Let's say, for example, my thumbnails, for example, they're actually, oh, well, I just died again. Dang it, I should just leave, but I think he's almost dead, probably. Yeah, he's got an orange bar. I don't actually have enough knowledge to actually know if he's dying or not. We'll find out. I'm sorry, it's mostly been me just kind of fighting this thing. I'm not actually powerful enough to do a lot of these world bosses yet. I mean, my gear score isn't that high, but regardless, when it comes down to it, like, let's say my thumbnails, for example, they are designed in the aspect that I was talking about to where I wanted those colors to be right. So I actually have very vibrant colors on there so that no matter what monitor it's on, it's actually going to look at the maximum contrast it's going to possibly have, so it can draw in more viewers. But I actually also have a high contrast ratio in the main one. And so I make sure that all of the kind of crucial information that I want everybody to see is going to be brighter than the rest of the information, like, let's say, the image that's not necessarily important. So I dim the background image, and then I make it so that a few things kind of pop out and make sure that those aspects are actually looked upon in the best light possible. And so, that's just one of those things that you can end up looking at. And that's a very basic example, but it's one of those things where when you're designing for these things, you actually should end up looking at all this stuff. And it can actually improve a lot of the aspects for a lot of the viewer retention and a lot of the aspects that your consumer is going to be seeing. Let's say you're an artist, for example. When you're designing your art, you should end up looking at, let's say, where is this actually going to be used and utilized? If you're doing like game art and stuff like that, why is he running away? I think he's chasing somebody because somebody aggroed him and he's just very upset. Let's say you're actually designing games, for example. Let's say when you're going into your resolution settings and stuff like that, when you're actually going in and designing for your environments and stuff like that, you want to make sure that when people are running on the lower end hardware, they don't, whoops, I did not put away my weapon. That's not actually what I pushed, but okay. when you're actually designing for these lower end settings and stuff like that, you want to make sure that you're actually optimizing which resolutions you're actually lowering. Like, let's say environment textures, for example. Let's say you have a brick wall and you have it so that when you're on high setting, it's on your absolute highest texture setting, but then when you go to medium, it puts it on low. The thing is, when you put it on low, it might actually affect the visual experience of the player a lot more than you would expect, and maybe you should actually have a in-between resolution. Or let's say you're doing UI, for example. When you're actually going into higher end hardware, what if they're not actually rendering it at a full window? What if they're not actually rendering it at a full resolution? You need to make sure that you have some sort of... God damn it, I died again. I'm just dying left and right. You want to make sure that you actually have it so that it will scale properly on different resolutions depending on what they're going to be able to run, not just monitors as well. It's actually going to be into one of those cases where you actually want it to be able to run on these different sort of GPUs, and like say they have to run games at 720p even though they have a 1920 by 1080 monitor. They still want to be able to run the game properly. And so there we go. Wait, did I spawn somewhere different? I think I did. Hold on. Why did I spawn all the way up here? All right, whatever. We're going to go down there. Sorry, I'm dying a lot. Anyways, yeah, so you want to make sure that you're able to actually design around this. And when you're going down to performance, obviously the way to kind of design around that when you're actually talking about, programming and web design is you just want to make sure that you have it so that it's optimized so it can run on lower end hardware. Have settings or options or different sort of, quality control sort of things. When you're actually doing web design, make sure that you have different web pages that load in differently depending on what type of content is going to be viewed. If you have dynamic streaming of content, make sure it's not streaming in 100 items at a time. Make sure it's streaming in like only 10 or 20 that's going to actually appear on the screen. And if you have resolution checking, let's say you actually have a dynamic website that's going to be changing on a grid for, like, let's say you're an artist, for example, and you have a portfolio site, and you have like 1,000 images on there, or maybe you're streaming it from something like DeviantArt or Imager. And so let's say you have it on there and you're like, all right, well, I want to stream it from the server or whatever. Make it so it only streams a certain amount so that lower end hardware doesn't end up getting choked out because basically it's trying to load too many images at once. Or you can end up looking at it and be like, all right, maybe I'm targeting a higher end audience. And then when you actually have that resolution checking, be like, oh, they're running at a higher resolution. Therefore, they have a higher end machine that's going to actually run that resolution properly. You can actually have it so that it's like, hey, maybe have a toggle at the top of your screen or something so it actually toggles it. You'll see this in shopping carts or searching lists all the time to where, let's say even Google, it's like, how many search results do you want to see per page? And you can have something like that. But you can actually adjust it based on resolution. It's like, oh, hey, I'm running this resolution. Like, let's say they're running, a 4K monitor. Make it so it'll actually display these images at a proper resolution. And make sure it scales as well. That's one thing that's very upsetting on monitors. It's when you actually have it, so you visit a web page and it looks miniature because basically they didn't do proper scaling. That's fairly annoying. Yes, you can zoom, and Microsoft has a solution within Windows, but at the same time, it's frustrating when the web designer didn't actually think of that. Regardless, modern design. So yeah, when it comes down to GPUs and CPUs, that actually doesn't affect... Ooh, hey, I got an awakening box. It actually doesn't affect your, your actual design aspects all that much. You just want to make sure everything is kind of optimized in a way that's actually going to work for everyone, and make sure that you have proper scaling in all of your different aspects. Now, when it comes down to storage, this is going to be the one that really doesn't affect all that many people, and it doesn't really have a lot of design aspects to it, but it does actually have a perspective change to it, because when you're actually working with hardware and stuff like that, one thing I didn't mention with the power is I did forget the perspective part. I apologize. But when it actually comes down to perspective, you actually have different sort of, running in rigs. It actually goes into the way that games work as well, to where basically, you go into this higher end machine and you're like, oh my God, it runs so much smoother. And that's pretty much how that works. Basically, when you're running in, let's say editing, for example, when you're running, like, let's say the Adobe Creative Suite, or you're running, Sony Vegas or something like that, when you actually have a higher end rig, you actually notice that these videos can actually get edited very much quicker. Or let's say you're editing things, like let's say your editing goes so much smoother, or let's say your rendering and stuff like that goes so much smoother. Or let's say video editing and stuff, or not video editing, but like image editing and stuff like that. Let's say you're a digital artist. When you actually get into a higher end rig, when I actually built my machine that I'm running right now, when I was actually upgrading it over that year and a half, I actually got a new GPU, which helped out Photoshop quite a bit with some acceleration, but I actually needed the CPU. And once I got that CPU, I got my 6700K. All of a sudden, like when I was drawing and stuff like that on the monitor and everything, it was actually so much more responsive and so much quicker, and it actually felt a lot better. And I was actually able to improve my digital art as well because it felt so much more natural, because I'm used to, drawing with a pen and pencil. I do a lot of black and art work. And so that's the sort of aspect that I'm used to. And so when I'm actually drawing on stuff like that, I can see it instantly and I'm able to use that as feedback. I'm able to texture and things like that. However, when you're working digitally, when you have a lower end machine, you run into that problem to where you have this sort of, you like try to draw a line. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. You try to draw a line and then you're like, all right, well, this line is taking a second to show up. And it actually affected me quite a bit more than I thought. And so when you actually work on higher end rigs, especially if you're like working with Photoshop and stuff like that, I recommend upgrading your CPU if you're actually running into problems with that. And it can change your perspective as an artist as well. And so things like drawing tablets as well, like when you actually get peripherals, which I'll talk about a little bit later. When you actually get peripherals and stuff like that, like let's say a drawing tablet, for example, when you actually use one of the ones where you can actually draw on, like Cintiqs, for example, those are one of them by Wacom, that completely changed my perspective of digital drawing. Oh my God, I so want one, but they're expensive and I can't afford one. Hopefully I can get one in the future, but at the same time, I'm just using a Wacom right now, which is a Intuos, and that actually changes your perspective a lot. Like drawing with the mouse, not exactly particularly great, although I do know some people that can draw with the mouse pretty dang well, which surprises the living hell out of me. At the same time, that can completely change your perspective on the way that everything works and the way that you kind of interact with the screen as well. And this actually goes into touchscreens as well, to where, you know, people have changed the way they actually interact with tech with like things like phones. You know, touchscreens on phones have become the interactive way to actually go into it. Instead of having like buttons and things like that, they just physically touch it, which actually makes sense in a physical sense, because it's like, I just want to touch things. You know, that's how we interact with the real world. For example, you pick up a cup, you know, you have your hand and you physically grab the cup. So when you actually physically touch something on a screen, I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, but that actually changes your perspective on it as well. But when it goes into games, you have different inputs and things like that, keyboard and mouse, and you have different game pads and stuff like that. You don't really necessarily have a way to design around that. However, when you design your games around that input, you should probably do so, you know, to make sure that you can actually use a gamepad or you can use a mouse and keyboard. I hate ports that get implemented and they have terrible mouse and keyboard support. You should always look at trying to improve that and make sure that they can actually use those properly. I'm not going to waste my time with storage. I'm actually going to go somewhere so we can actually fight things. Also, I noticed my frame rate's dipping a little bit. It's probably because I'm recording. I apologize for that. Now, when it gets into storage, this isn't something that really affects, you know, designing very well. Obviously, you want to optimize things. It just goes into the same sort of optimizations that you do. Like, let's say streaming images and things like that. Make sure you're only streaming a certain amount of content. When you get into games, though, this is where one of those heavy sort of aspects comes into play. The game in the background, Black Desert, has a ton of pop-in, and the major reason for this is the fact that it has to load a lot of resources at once, and so it does a lot of streaming of this data, and so that actually goes down into storage limitations. Now, I'm running this on an SSD, and it's actually running quite well, and so it loads everything up, but if you're not, when I was running on a hard drive, for example, and I was actually trying to record, during my review, it actually crashed the game because it wasn't able to actually load the data quick enough, and so it can actually crash your game. Now, when it comes down to, you know, designing for that, you just want to make sure everything streams at a nice rate and you'll actually notice it. But when it comes down to perspective, the faster the storage you get, the more responsive games feel to load and the quicker loading times you end up getting. When it goes down to loading pages and stuff like that, when it goes down to like web browsers, or when you're loading in a new page, or let's say you're loading up some new artwork or loading up your tools for whatever you're going to be drawing with, that sort of stuff, all of a sudden that stuff starts loading really, really quickly. Now, when it comes down to the general consumer, hard drive is all I'm going to recommend. Like, just get a normal hard drive. You're perfectly fine. You're not really going to notice too much of a problem. When it gets into gaming, maybe consider an SSD, although SSDs don't really improve performance all that much in very many games. I've noticed on my own rig, like a lot of games that I thought it would improve the performance on, it really didn't improve the performance all that much, which was a little bit disappointing, and I was hoping to get a little bit better loading times, but it comes down to limitations of the engine and things like that that actually affects most of that. And so that was a little bit disappointing. But when it comes down to actually, you know, what it actually changes, it just changes the general speed of things. When I actually go into, like, let's say when I was just using my hard drive, my recording hard drive had died, so all of my software had to run off of a single hard drive. When I was going on there, I was basically like loading times on, you know, loading up Windows was like an entire like few minutes. Now it's in 5 seconds. It's loaded up, Steam's up, all my Adobe programs are ready to launch. Everything just loads up responsively. I click on Google Chrome, for example, it loads up immediately. And that can completely change your perspective on things because it changes how long it takes to actually go into things. And it changes how long, like, let's say Photoshop, for example. Photoshop felt so slow to launch and everything, and it had like this whole huge thing to where it's like basically like I was waiting for it to load and I'd be like, all right, I'm just going to like go play a mobile game or something like that for 20 minutes while it was loading and everything. But then when I got an SSD, I don't have to do that anymore, which is kind of nice. It's not going to be that big of a like changer of perspective. And I would say storage is probably going to be the one that affects things the least. But it also goes into RAM, for example. Like RAM, you want to look at how much RAM people have and stuff like that when you're going into designing. But for the most part, really RAM is going to be the only thing storage-wise that's really going to change perspective. I have noticed, though, that having an SSD has improved my editing experience a lot, and it has changed my professional experience quite a bit as well, like when I'm actually using it, but it doesn't necessarily change my perspective, which I would say is a little bit disappointing. So if you're wondering on the SSD thing, yes, it was worth the money. I am enjoying the performance increase a lot, and it makes it so that editing is so much easier because basically having all my Adobe programs, obviously all my cache is still working off of my normal hard drive, because otherwise that would just be asinine, you know, destroying my SSD by having all this random data thrown onto it, because basically you don't really need all that fast of storage when it comes down to actually, because SSDs don't have a higher write speed. And so basically when you're making these cache files, it doesn't have to access them very often, because if you have something like, let's say, you know, I have 32 gigs of RAM, you don't necessarily need to worry about it. Now let's talk about peripherals a little bit. I mostly covered down to it, you know, what it was and the design aspect of it. Basically, you know, how you're designing, you know, your inputs and everything like that. Just make sure you actually have things configurable when it comes down to things like games and web design. When it comes down to web design, though, you do want to look at things like, let's say, touch input. When you're working on, let's say you're working on a website and you need a navigation bar. One thing that I notice a lot is in mobile design sites, they have the whole, you know, icon to where you can click on it and go into it. However, one thing that I end up doing is I actually have a classic nav bar, because I don't have all these different types of pages. I just have a single page website. And so basically what I ended up doing is just having it so that it's a top bar. And one of the things that you want to look at in this is that drop menus do not work in the mobile interface. They don't work in touchscreen interfaces, because let's say you're like, let's say hover options as well, like hover menus, like newegg.com, for example, is a website that has it so that when you hover over a button, you actually see it. And so they actually have an entire different website based on if you're on mobile or not. So if you're designing a website and you want to actually have it, you know, working on both inputs, perfectly fine. You need to make sure that you're not using things that's going to be exclusive to one or the other. So, for example, on touch devices, the only way to hover is to make it so that you're actually just holding down on top of something, which means you're not going to be able to see anything that's under your finger, which means that that's probably not the best way to design your menus. And so you'll probably want to make sure that you could actually have to click your menus, and that would make it feel much more responsive. While it may not feel more responsive on the, you know, let's say a normal computer, because basically we're used to hover menus at the same time, I would say, as a personal experience, I hate hover menus, because basically I'll hover over something and it will get stuck, because basically the website is designed like ass, and then basically I can't actually click on anything, or it obscures the menu, or maybe I'm just moving the mouse so I can actually see something a little bit better. Oh, these drop area blades, I need those. And so basically, drop down menus in general, make sure they're not hover, make sure they're click, because otherwise they're just really, really extremely annoying. But that's just my personal opinion. So when it comes down to designing, make sure you're actually looking at the different types of inputs. And obviously in the future, we could end up having different VR implementations as well. It's for different types of inputs as well. And you should just make sure that you can have everything configurable, and make it so that, let's say you're designing a game, for example, make sure that you can actually design everything so that it can be like, oh, hey, you can use this on a gamepad, you can use this on a keyboard, you can use this on whatever thing. Just make sure it's a general input that has any API that you can use. Let's say you're using Unreal Engine, for example, or using SDK or SDL for an SDK and everything. So you could use things like X input or direct input and things like that, and make sure you're supporting all of them as well. Or you can use Steam, for example. I know Sonic Mania uses Steam's kind of control input API, and so you can use something like that. So just make sure that people are able to configure based on whatever input they're using. And basically that changes how the perspective can kind of go into. You know, the general aspect of it is that everything on, like, just the general way that you interact with the world is going to change how you perceive it. And when it comes down to, you know, tech, every single piece of hardware is going to slightly change it. I would say storage, like I said, is probably the least, you know, one that's going to affect everything. But it does affect it a decent amount, because you run into a situation to where things just kind of load faster. And so when I go into pages, it just feels like everything is more responsive. And while that doesn't necessarily go into the way things were designed, because basically, you know, things are going to take a limited number of resources no matter what happens, it can actually, you know, affect the experience in a different way. And it actually completely changes my perspective of higher end rigs. I did not expect how much an SSD would actually affect my loading screen times. I didn't expect, well, actually I did expect, when I was getting a new monitor, I expected how much, you know, getting that color accuracy would actually affect it. So even though I could have saved myself a ton of money, or could have gotten a higher refresh rate, because right now I'm still running at 60 FPS, I could have easily, you know, gotten 120 FPS or 144 FPS for half the price. But at the same time, I wanted that color accuracy because I knew how much it would actually affect my design and how much it would actually affect how I'm able to design things. I'm able to actually look at things and be like, all right, this is how it's going to look more in print. And this is how I can actually look at things and be like, all right, well, this is going to have a high contrast ratio, or can actually easily see like what different colors are actually going to be affected. So let's say there's two colors right next to each other and they're not just not right. And they're just barely off. I can actually fix that and be like, all right, well, everything's supposed to be the same color, and I can actually fix it without actually having to go in and use a color swatcher and use like, the color ID and everything like that. And so basically it adds in a lot of different perspectives you can actually look into and a lot of different professional aspects as well. So if you're actually, in the design aspects and stuff like that, you're in the design industry or designing games and stuff like that, do look into getting some higher end hardware. And I'm not saying that just because it's awesome to have higher end hardware. Quite frankly, you don't need high end hardware to do anything these days. You can actually, like I said, I was working with artwork on a very low end machine, but it can actually improve a lot of aspects of your art and of your work that you're actually working on when you actually have a decent machine. And there's different aspects of your machine that you're going to want to upgrade. For example, if you're just an artist that's only working with artwork, maybe you want to just upgrade everything that's going to be like, let's say your monitor. You get a decent CPU that's going to work with Photoshop and your touching tablet, or maybe you have a Cintiq and everything. And you're just going to want to make sure you have good color reproduction on your monitors. And so that's going to be one thing. Make sure you have the proper input. So you have like a drawing tablet or a Cintiq or something along those lines that's going to make it so that you can actually interact just like you would in physical media. Or maybe you're not used to physical media. Maybe you're used to drawing with the mouse for some odd reason and you're like 1 in a million or 1 in a billion, I would say. I don't think anybody draws with the mouse really. But when you end up getting into that, make sure that you have the proper inputs that you want. And when it comes down to gaming, when you're actually building a higher end rig, make sure you're focusing on things that actually matter. Don't really focus on RAM. Get enough RAM that you can actually run games. Like let's say 16 gigs of RAM, although 32 gigs is eventually going to become the standard. By then you're going to be upgrading your machine again. But make sure you get 16 gigs of RAM so you can actually run any game. Maybe you can actually do some like side projects and stuff like that on the side. Maybe you can actually, run things like, let's say you have Google Chrome on the side and you're watching some live streams of other gamers, or maybe you're watching some videos, or maybe you're watching, my friend was watching Rick and Morty like earlier today, and he's like, yeah, I'm watching Rick and Morty, and having a CPU can actually help with that because you're able to actually run the CPU for the game and you can actually run it. Or maybe you want to look into a second monitor for that type of stuff as well. So you want to live stream on a second monitor and stuff like that. And when you get into art and stuff like that, you can have your tools on one monitor, and you can have it, that's one aspect I didn't actually talk about in the monitor aspect, where I actually have multiple monitors. And so I actually have on the right side of my screen, I have all my monitoring for when I'm recording and stuff like that. So it can actually, change the way that you look into it. And that's mostly talking about upgrades and stuff and not really your perspective. But when you're upgrading for performance for video games, make sure you upgrade your GPU. And if you're just somebody that's going into web browsers, just make sure you have a decent monitor that works for you, and make sure you have your inputs like your keyboard and your mouse and stuff like that. And just make sure that you have everything that you need. And generally, that's what it goes down to. Make sure that you end up getting a machine that you actually need, and don't look at people when they actually get a higher-end hardware and be like, why would you need that? Because the higher-end hardware you have, the better your perspective and the more towards an intended aspect you can actually have. Because let's say for gaming, for example, there is an intended hardware. There is the intention when they actually design their stuff, they actually have it on a specific rig. And when they're actually designing, they're like, all right, well, this rig needs to be on here. Also, I realized my weapon's breaking, so I need to go fix it in game. But basically, when they're actually looking at that, there's going to be intended, like I was talking about for Slime Sand, which once again, I have a review for that. So if you want to look at a review, go ahead and check that out. I didn't end up recommending it to a lot of people, but you can end up checking that out. But they actually had that problem to where they probably designed the game on the specific hardware and they had specific monitors. And so basically whenever I was actually playing it on a different monitor with different color and everything, I actually found the colors obnoxious. However, on a similar monitor, what they would have been working on, game looks perfectly fine. I don't really have a problem with it. And so, it's one of those things where a lot of things can actually change your perspective. And I think a lot of people need to start considering that, especially when they're building different rigs or they're looking at designing things for different rigs, and game design especially needs to look into that. And I know color options and things like that, where like color blindness have gotten better over the years, but that also goes into it. Maybe the monitors aren't going to display those properly and stuff like that. And so you need to look at those as well. And what if monitors actually had colorblind options? I think that would be pretty cool if more monitors had those. I know my monitors does, but most monitors do not. Anyways, that's going to be mostly me for this topic. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this one. This one was a little bit longer-winded, and it wasn't necessarily something I scripted out before. It was mostly a bunch of ideas, and I kind of wanted to talk about it a lot in depth, and it comes from the idea that I was upgrading my PC. It was a lot of kind of aspects I was going into. I was like, all right, I need to upgrade my machine. What am I going to get and everything? And there's a lot of talk about like, oh, well, this is the best performing one. It's like, yes, that's the best performing one. Like, let's say modders, for example, you know, they're like, oh yeah, get this TN panel that runs at 144 FPS. But the problem is, like, 144 hertz isn't going to do anything if I don't enjoy the colors on it, and I need good color reproduction. When I was looking up, like, oh, where do I get good color reproduction? Oh my God, was it a hassle to find literally anything? And so, you know, it's one of those things that I think people need to look into more because, you know, let's say for low-end hardware and stuff like that, a lot of the people running on lower-end machines, they just don't see the idea of getting higher-end hardware. And I feel like that's a general aspect of tech that a lot of people don't understand, and I feel like it's very misunderstood because a lot of people, if you talk to people that don't know tech, they don't understand why people will spend so much money on getting a decent rig, and it comes down to a matter of perspective. It literally changes a lot of the things you see inside the gaming world. It's not just for performance. And yes, it is poor performance, but that performance isn't the reason why you're getting that better hardware. You're getting that better hardware for the experience. You're getting that better hardware because you want the better perspective. You want to be able to experience games at their intended rate, and you want to be able to experience things in a smooth and enjoyable way. You want to feel the game instead of just being like, yes, it's an experience. You're not just browsing a web browser where it's going to be like, yeah, you're loading up this thing, but you're also going in and actually experiencing a world. You're experiencing it. And the way that your PC is built is how you're going to perceive it. So anyways, the game in the background has been Black Desert. Normally, I try and say that before I get too much into blabbery stuff, but hey, there we go. I'm still not necessarily sure on how to introduce games because I know that this video is pretty long-winded, and so some people are going to be like, oh, what game is that before even finishing the video because basically they're not really going to watch the entire video. But the game in the background has been Black Desert. It's an MMO. It has some performance problems, but I've been running it on an SSD, which has helped with the pop-in a little bit. Like, it just makes it a little bit smoother, and so I'm not necessarily running into problems to where the game is stuttering because it can't load objects and stuff like that, but it's still just... It's an MMO. I don't know if people expect the best performance from an MMO, so I apologize that most of this video was me just fighting a world boss, but that's actually a fun experience. I did lose a ton of experience, though. Oh my God, I lost like I think I was at 38%. So I lost like 10%, I think. No, I think I was at 33%. I think my other character's at 35. I can't remember. Anyways, it's a fun sandbox/sand park MMO. I think it's more of a sandbox. It's just kind of one of those games you can roam around and do whatever you want. It has some awesome combat. I have a full review of it. If you want to check that out, it'll be linked in the end screen thing, which should be popping up any second now. Like I said, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.